As the sun vanished beyond the medieval horizon, darkness brought no peace, only cold, fear, and the flicker of dying embers. In the medieval times, sleep was not a sanctuary. It was a nightly battle. Against frost. Against filth. Against things that crept in silence. This is the forgotten story of how our ancestors closed their eyes, not to dream, but to endure. There were no radiators, no down blankets. Just the damp breath of livestock, the scratch of straw, and the wind howling through wooden slats. Beds, as we know them, were rare. And comfort, that was a luxury reserved for kings. But even the rich were not spared. In drafty stone castles, beneath vaulted ceilings, lords and ladies huddled in their lairs, whispering prayers to keep the night terrors at bay. What we now take for granted, warmth, silence, a soft mattress, was, for most of history, a dream within a dream. So why was medieval sleep so hard? And how did people survive it, night after night? Subscribe to join us as we pull back the furs and lift the straw mats on the forgotten realities of medieval sleep. In the medieval world, the night was not one long stretch of rest, it was two distinct acts in a silent ritual of survival. The first sleep began shortly after sunset, when the chores were done, the hearth dimmed, and even the animals lay still. It lasted about 4 hours, the deepest, heaviest slumber. But then, sometime between midnight and 2 a.m. they woke up. And that waking was not strange. It was expected. This in-between period was called the vigil. A time not for work, but for thought. For prayer. For quiet intimacy. Some sharpened tools, mended torn tunics, or tended the embers. Others walked next door to speak softly with a neighbor. In a world without clocks, time flowed differently, slowly, deliberately. Writers of the time called it the hour of the soul, when the body rested, and the mind awakened. In France and England, it was believed that between the first and second sleep, God was closest. After an hour or two, the second sleep began, lighter, shorter, but enough to prepare for the rooster's crow and the long day ahead. This rhythm, known today as biphasic sleep, was not some quirk of olden times. Modern research, especially by historian Roger Ekirch, confirms it may be our body's natural state when left in true darkness. What we lost with streetlights and smartphones was a sacred pause between dreams. Imagine ending your day not in a cozy bed with crisp linens, but on the same patch of floor where you cooked your dinner and mended your boots. For most medieval peasants, there was no such thing as a bedroom. The family's entire life happened in a single space, workroom by day, sleeping chamber by night. Beds, if you could call them that, were sacks of straw or hay laid directly on the ground, sometimes wrapped in coarse linen, sometimes just dumped into the corner. If you were lucky, there might be a sheepskin to soften the prickly straw and repel the fleas. And no one slept in pajamas. Everyone, men, women, children, went to bed in the same wool tunics, hose, and even boots they wore in the fields. The warmest spot in the room, by the hearth. That is where the sick, the old, and the smallest children were laid down, closest to the dying embers. And the sleeping space was not just for humans. Chickens clucked softly in the dark. A pig snorted in the corner. Sometimes a goat shuffled near your feet. In that crowded room, the heat of bodies, human and animal, was more reliable than any blanket. And privacy, that was a concept for kings. In the medieval home, sleep was communal. Raw. Physical. And absolutely essential. While peasants huddled together on straw and stone, the wealthy did not exactly drift off in feather-stuffed bliss either. Sleep in the Middle Ages was a tiered affair. And even the nobility had no true privacy. Noble families often slept in shared rooms, not just with each other, but with servants, pages, and nursemaids. Privacy came not from walls, but from drapery. Heavy curtains or tapestries offered the illusion of solitude. Beds were made of solid wood, often elaborately carved, raised high off the ground, but inside, no memory foam. Just wool, straw, or maybe a feather mattress. If you were lucky. Among warriors and house retinues, sleep was a matter of discipline. In barracks or great halls, men lay in tidy rows on benches or rough pallets, boots still on, swords nearby. In southern Europe, where the climate was warmer, sleep might come atop a smooth stone ledge, covered with woven mats or sheepskins. Further north, in colder regions, castle builders took advantage of architectural quirks, with beds nestled into wall recesses where heat from the hearth could be trapped and drafts held back. Cradles, when they existed, were often strung from beams to keep babies off the cold floor and away from rodents. And doors, not always. Fabric or hanging cloths often served as the only barrier between sleep and the cold hall beyond. Even in grandeur, sleep was imperfect. Between flickering firelight, howling wind, and the snores of half the household, everyone, high or low, learned to sleep in company. In the Middle Ages, sleep was not something you did alone. It was something you did together. Body to body. Breath to breath. Warmth was not just comfort, it was survival. Shoulder to shoulder, entire families curled up along the wall or near the dying hearth. Mother, father, child. Goat. The body heat of humans, and animals, formed a living furnace. Blankets were rare. More often, warmth came from old cloaks, homespun shawls, or whatever rags could be spared. There were no pillows. Heads rested on folded arms, shoes, or bags of grain. And there was certainly no privacy. Even newlyweds slept with the rest of the family, hidden, at best, behind a piece of hanging fabric. Not out of shame, but because privacy was a luxury no one could afford. Sleep was not an escape from the world. It was part of the world. A continuation of the day's labor. Of its closeness. And of its noise. It was a many-voiced dream, a shared experience, a nightly reminder that you were not alone, for better or worse. Medieval people did not have luxury, but they had something more enduring, ingenuity. In the battle against damp, cold, and infestation, the bed, such as it was, became a small fortress of survival. The top chan, a humble raised bedstead, was one of the peasants' finest inventions. Built near the stove, raised on logs or bricks, it lifted the sleeper above the dampness that crept up from the earthen floor. They layered it with whatever they had, rag cushions, bundles of hemp, dry reeds, or mats made from twisted cloth. Those lucky enough to afford it filled canvas sacks with sheep's wool, or whatever could mimic softness. But among the poor, comfort was relative. Dryness was a miracle. Warmth, even more so. In wealthier homes, sleeping nets or canvas cradles were stretched across wooden frames, primitive hammocks that kept sleepers suspended above the cold floor. But beyond the home, sleep had to adapt. In monasteries and military camps, comfort was an afterthought. Sacks filled with ash or hardened earth became impromptu mattresses. They were cheap, reusable, and easy to carry. During war, soldiers laid boards over the ground and padded them with cloaks or hay. These beds were not made for dreams. They were made for endurance. A barrier between the body and the chill of the world. When winter fell on the medieval world, it was not just cold, it was a test of will. a biting trial that crept through stone, wood, and wool alike. At night, homes did not sleep, they endured. Forget down comforters. A medieval blanket might be nothing more than a patched cloak from a dead relative, a flour sack sewn shut and stuffed with hay, or a quilt made of scraps that told a family's history in stitches. Families layered everything they owned: shirts, aprons, rags stitched into patchwork layers, faded from time and firelight. But if you were lucky, you had a fur. Goat. Wolf. Bear. Heavy, oily, smelling of smoke and salt, repellents not just for insects, but for the cold itself. Children were buried, not metaphorically, literally buried between their parents, curled against their bodies for warmth. One blanket. One body heat source. Many limbs, breaths, dreams, all tangled together in survival's embrace. Meanwhile, the wealthy, they had tricks of their own. Velvet curtains hung from bed frames. Canopies and tapestries turned a bed into a tent of warmth. Some even hung blankets on the walls to block out drafts, turning stone into something softer. Something livable. But regardless of class, warmth was a war. The night demanded creativity. Layers. Proximity. And above all, the determination to wake up. In the icy hush of a medieval winter night, even breath turned brittle. There was no central heating, no electric blanket. But there was stone, the ancient ally of fire. Peasants and nobles alike heated bricks or river stones in the fire, then wrapped them in rags, old cloth, or fur, and tucked them into their beds like secret sons. The stone went to the feet first, the coldest part of the body. Then to the chest. Then the hands. A ritual of warmth passed down through generations. In wealthier homes, monasteries and castles, they had something fancier, the metal foot warmer. A tiny, glowing box of embers, encased in iron and tucked under tapestries. These were not just for sleep. Even during the day, warm stones followed the people. Tucked into laps while spinning thread. Cradled by the elderly. Clutched in freezing workshops. Simple. Ingenious. Stone absorbed the flame, and returned it slowly, like a loyal friend. This was medieval ingenuity, when comfort was carved not from luxury, but from glowing rocks in the belly of winter. In the Middle Ages, sleep did not start with undressing. On the contrary, the night often began with putting more on. Cold drafts slithered through cracks in the timber and stone. The earthen floor held the chill like a curse. To undress was to invite sickness. Or death. So they slept in their tunics, their hose, sometimes even their boots, stiff with mud, but still better than bare skin against the frost. Soldiers in camps did not dare remove them. Boots meant readiness. At any moment, the trumpet could sound, and they had to move. Even monks, bound by routine and silence, were known to sleep in their robes and shoes during bitter months. Peasants layered fur capes, woolen shawls, and heavy cloaks, not for luxury, but for survival. Clothes became bedding. Bedding became armor. To sleep was to brace yourself, wrapped in every scrap of warmth, against a night that asked nothing but endurance. But even wrapped in rags and cloaks, warmth did not mean safety. In the dark, the true enemies crept closer, silent, crawling, biting. Fleas nested deep in straw that had not been changed since autumn. Bed bugs clung to beams and sackcloth, waiting for blood. Rats were bolder still, rustling through food scraps, chewing through cloth, even gnawing at hands and faces of the weakest sleepers. Wormwood and juniper were burned in bowls or thrown into the fire, not for scent, but survival. But there were threats the smoke could not touch, diseases that bloomed in damp lungs, or rode on another's cough. And when the body trembled in the dark, when a weight pressed down but nothing was there, they blamed demons, nightmares, sleep paralysis, a choking presence. They called it the night hag, and believed the devil had come calling. So salt was placed at the bedpost, iron nails hammered into the doors, crosses etched in charcoal above the hearth. To sleep in the Middle Ages was not just to rest. It was to battle against vermin, sickness, and unseen forces that watched in the dark. Midnight was not simply the dead of night, it was the hour of mystery, when shadows whispered and the veil between worlds thinned. Between the first and second sleep, the soul was said to be most exposed, and the spirits most active. It was then, in this witching hour, that people whispered prayers and made small offerings to the unseen. Bread for the wandering dead, salt for protection, iron under the bed, or a knife beneath the pillow, to ward off the night. Some said if you looked out the window at night, you might meet the gaze of something that should not be seen. Owls were feared, not for their wisdom, but for their warnings. Their cry foretold death, sickness, or worse. Even the wind could stir dread. Was it the howl of a soul in torment, or just the forest breathing? No one dared to ask. Some villages hired night watchmen, not just to guard from thieves, but to walk with a cross, chanting psalms against the dark. This fear was not foolishness. It was survival. In a world without light, the mind filled in the dark with everything it feared most. In times of war and famine, sleep was no longer a routine, it was a privilege, a gamble, and sometimes, a death sentence. Soldiers often slept in armor, backs against trees or earth walls, swords still gripped in frozen hands. There was no lying down. The ground was mud. The cold was bone deep. The next attack could come at any moment. Fatigue gnawed at the mind like rats on grain. Dreams blurred with nightmares, if sleep came at all. And when famine struck, sleep was just another form of suffering. Hollow stomachs growled through the night. Bodies too weak to rest. Minds too alert with hunger and fear. Chronicles tell of men sleeping while standing, not from discipline, but collapse. Even in monasteries, the cold was too cruel. The brethren shivered in silence, their prayers echoing in frost-covered cells. Sleep deprivation was more dangerous than arrows. It dulled swords, slowed limbs, broke spirits. When survival depended on being ready, sleep became a traitor. Yet without it, men died standing. Sleep, in the Middle Ages, was not a gift of peace. It was a daily trial, a battle fought against cold, fear, and filth. It was not about dreams. It was about staying alive. Warmth was borrowed from bodies, blankets stitched from rags and memory. There were no plush mattresses, no down pillows. Just hay, rough wool, and the breath of your kin, or your cow, to keep the frost at bay. But in this nightly hardship, there was strength. A resilience woven into every strand of sackcloth and soul. They woke not refreshed, but together. And that, in their world, was triumph. So next time you climb into a warm bed with quiet walls and soft sheets, remember, your ancestors once slept in straw, prayed to make it to dawn. And did. Medieval sleep, not just rest, but resistance.